Hi, I'm Beth Strathman. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the general history of the resurgence of feminine archetypes or feminine energy. So it's going to be a very general stroll through time, but I think it's kind of enlightening when you look at the stretch of time where we've been under patriarchy and the feminine archetype has resurged every now and again, and even including today in the 21st century, in our current time. I think it's important, though, as I lay out some of these resurgences of the feminine energy, to keep in mind that the feminine archetype is really influenced by cultural context. So that is really, and over time it has changed. So it's really important to keep that in mind. Because again, I'm talking in very broad generalities and only from my own learning and experience, mostly about Western civilization. And so there you go. So let's first wind the clock back, or actually wind the calendar back a long time ago into the Neolithic civilization. So we're back easily 10,000 years from today. So 10,000 years ago up to about 5,000 years ago. This is the Neolithic period, and when we look at the archaeological evidence that was found in what is called Old Europe and Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey, and even in some of the Middle East, in like ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, and Assyria. We look at these cultures, and they, during this Neolithic period, really the feminine archetype was very elevated. In fact, it was at least in partnership with the masculine archetype and maybe have been elevated slightly above it. During this time, these cultures tended to worship the great goddess. So their major deity was feminine, and she was considered the source of all creation and the source of all sustenance. So it was a relationship similar to what an infant child may perceive with its mother. Totally dependent on it, but in very close relationship with this feminine energy. So she provided, like I said, all the food, all the bounty of the earth that people relied upon. People noted the cyclical nature of things, and looking at things in a cyclical way instead of a linear way is a more feminine way of interpreting the world. So they had the cyclical nature of the seasons, they had the cyclical routines of their daily life, and they even had the cyclical nature of the stars that they would track, particularly on the solstices and the equinoxes. We know this from the giant stone monuments that are built, particularly in Europe and Northern Africa and the Middle East, that track the position of the sun on those 4 points during the year, the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes. Then about roughly 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, there starts to be a shift from these more feminine-oriented matrilineal societies into more patriarchal or male-oriented societies. Now that shift didn't happen overnight. It happened over a couple thousand years perhaps, but it did start to shift, so that by about certainly 2,500 years ago, so in 500 BC or even a little earlier, the great goddess had been taken off her pedestal, and she was demoted in the pantheon of gods in these particular cultures, because they were often polytheistic, to a lesser god. And oftentimes they would take the great goddess and they would create multiple goddesses from her that did different things, that the great goddess used to do all of those things used to be under her. And these now lesser goddesses would often be given duties that had to do with fertility, relationships, marriage, that kind of thing. Also, they were often then made the consort of a more powerful male god. So, for example, you see Hera in Greece. Hera was the queen of heaven, the queen of the gods. She was now the consort of Zeus. Before, she had been more independent, before the patriarchy came in. She had been a more independent goddess, and she was really the symbol of healthy relationships between females, friendships between females. Then, through a patriarchal lens, as that became more prevalent, she was reduced to a goddess who was often insecure, jealous, and petty. Examples of other goddesses who it's thought started out more independent and more of the primary deity. We have Isis in Egypt, we have Athena in Greece, and we have Kuan Yin in East Asian countries. But even though the patriarchy had swept in and unseated the great goddess, she wasn't quite done yet. We fast forward to the 1st century in the Common Era, around the time of Jesus Christ. And actually, it's Jesus and the movement that he started was actually a resurgence of the feminine. Even though he was in Judea, which was under the control of the very patriarchal Roman Empire, his message in his ministry was God is love. That's a fairly feminine message there of the feminine archetype. And this kind of love that he was preaching was very egalitarian, another feminine quality, the egalitarianism. It encompassed everyone, regardless of race, creed, gender. It didn't matter. All were welcome to participate, to join his ministry and his movement. He showed concern for everyone, including women, and oftentimes women were not ministered to in the Jewish culture the same as men, right? Again, they were a subclass under men, women were. So he broke these cultural and even legal prohibitions regarding women's spiritual and social place in Jewish society. In fact, an interesting note is that his ministry was largely funded by wealthy women. Go Jesus. So, now also, although today Christian doctrine only recognizes 12 male apostles, some religious scholars believe that Mary Magdalene was also an apostle of Jesus. There's also a Gospel of Mary that was excluded from official church canon in the early medieval period. So the ministry of Jesus Christ in the 1st century was an example of a resurgence of the feminine archetype in what he preached and what he stood for. Now in the 1st century of the Common Era, we're going to fast forward to the Middle Ages. So certainly around the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. This is the time when the cathedrals were being built in Europe. And many of these cathedrals, Catholic cathedrals, were being built in honor of the Virgin Mary, right? So there was a whole resurgence of worshiping the feminine in the church. So in these cathedrals, we have Notre Dame, we have Chartres, and we have we have the Lady Chapels in Great Britain. They were all dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So in this way, women were idealized for their purity, their motherhood, for their devotion, and for their modesty. So the Virgin Mary became a symbol of that aspect of the resurgence of the feminine. I will mention, though, too, a little earlier than this time period, probably 1,000 years earlier, in the 800s, 900s, thousands, when the idea of courtly love started to come into the courts of Europe, That, I think, was an expression of the feminine, a more civilized way of being and honoring relationships, etc. From the Middle Ages, we move to the Enlightenment period, which was about 1685 to about 1815 or so. During the Enlightenment, the feminine archetype reemerged through discussions about women's empowerment, their rights, and gender equity. This was the time period, in this time period, in the late 1700s, of course, we saw the people's revolutions of what is now the United States, and then shortly thereafter, France and its revolution. In France, during their revolution, their motto was about liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And so liberty, equality, those are all feminine qualities or values. Brotherhood, well, we'll say that's a feminine quality too, because it's about people, the common people sticking together. So you can see the resurgence there during the Enlightenment phase. A few years later, in the mid 1840s, in the mid 1800s, about 1840, we go into the Victorian age, where again we continue this theme of discussions, ideas around women's suffrage, women's equality, women's roles in society, women's rights. Even if those rights were not thought of as being extended to all women, there were discussions around it. Of course, this is the time in the United States where you have Susan B. Anthony coming into public life, talking about women's suffrage, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Women's suffrage is now kind of simmering during the Victorian era underneath everything else that's going on. Still, during the Victorian era, those gender ideals under the patriarchy won't go away. So once again, being a good wife and mother were the ways that were acceptable to be as a woman. So you were only a good woman if you were a mother, a nurturer, and you were self-sacrificing. Now we move to the early 20th century, where we see that traditional notions of femininity are being challenged still. Women try to break free from the restrictive roles that they're allowed to play in society. There is the women's suffrage movement that is gaining steam. There are movements to educate women, allow them into colleges and professional institutions like medical schools and law school, and for women to have equal rights in society with men. And of course, in the latter half of the 20th century, we see the women's movement of the 60s and 70s, where women were working towards more equality in society under leaders in that movement like Betty Friedan, Shirley Chisholm, Gloria Steinem. They focused on women's independence, autonomy, individualism, and their ability to express themselves by working in various occupations, not just being relegated to housewife, teacher, secretary. Now coming into today, in the 21st century, we see that the masculine is still more favored in our Western society here in the United States than is the feminine. However, the feminine archetype has continued to resurge and evolve into more prominence in our society. The feminine movements that I previously mentioned from the 20th century have allowed those of us today to work in any field we want to, and to expand the roles and qualities that are associated with femininity. We don't have to be demure people who stay in the background anymore. We can be out there asserting ourselves and going after what we want. Additionally, the broader range of identities for all people, as the media displays now, includes discussions around intersectionality, LGBTQ plus rights, and the recognition of non-binary and transgendered identities. So again, the feminine is very inclusive. That is a value of the feminine. So this resurgence or this emergence of seeing all kinds of people, describing themselves in multiple ways, not just male and female, is a feminine value. And I think in family life, the idea that both mothers and fathers can nurture their children, or that mothers can be the primary breadwinner and the father can stay home to rear the children primarily, is another indication of how the feminine has reemerged. So I think overall it is important to remember that the interpretation of femininity is done in a cultural context. It's not the same everywhere in the world. And I think it's important to keep in mind that many indigenous cultures have always been more matrilineal and focused on the feminine than maybe what we call, Western civilization has. So everything is not a monolith. It's not all the same everywhere in the world, but this is just sort of a way of looking at least in my experience, how the feminine has been trying to pop up throughout a long 10,000 year plus history, and that perhaps it will become more acceptable and on par with the masculine archetype, so that there's more balance in our world. So I, for one, am looking forward to more balance between the masculine and the feminine, and all I can say after 10,000 plus years of history is finally. So, thanks for watching today. I'll catch you next time.